The first thing that strikes you about Victorian London isn't the cold or the fog. It's the breathing. The whole city seems to inhale and exhale in long, uneven rhythms, like a beast made of brick and smoke. Its breath carries the scent of coal dust, river mud, baked bread, sewage, and something sweeter that you can't quite identify. Maybe hope, maybe danger. The line between the two has always been blurry here. You step off the main road and almost instantly feel the city noticing you. Not the official city, the one with churches and parliament and respectable families polishing their brass door handles, but the other version, the one stitched between alleys and gas lamps, where life happens in the cracks. If you listen carefully, you'll hear how the city really speaks. A muttered bargain, a slammed door, a carriage rolling too quietly, a girl laughing too brightly. Most people who lived in this era insisted that the city was a grand triumph of civilization, progress, industry, morality. But the truth, the part they kept tucked beneath their polished shoes, was that London survived on the labor of the desperate, the invisible, the people whose names crowded no statues, but filled every police ledger and workhouse list. Tonight, you're going to follow some of them. Not the factory owners or the politicians who appear in museums. Instead, you'll trail the women who made the city's nighttime economy run with a precision no businessman ever admitted. Women whose lives tangled with survival, desire, violence, risk, and the razor-thin line between respectability and ruin. But before you meet any of them, you need to see the city with fresh eyes. A street split in half. Walk down a bright avenue, say Regent Street, and everything looks orderly. Men in starched collars stride with conviction. Women in tailored bodices float past with parasols angled just so. They talk about opera performances or new editions of poetry, pretending not to notice the way the shadows wrinkle at the edges of their world. Take 3 steps sideways, just 3 steps into a narrow passageway, and the entire mood shifts. The gas lamps here are spaced wider apart. Their flames flicker in the damp air, unable to fully decide whether to illuminate or conceal. Water drips from an eave overhead. Somewhere nearby, a cat yows in irritation. Someone shouts and then laughs. Then the laughter cuts abruptly, replaced by a sharp hush that tells you something transactional just occurred. This is the version of the city no official guidebooks described. And yet, this is where thousands of women lived out their nights. The phantom population. Victorian newspapers loved numbers, especially scandalous ones. One claimed London had 40,000 fallen women. Another swore the number was closer to 80,000. A moral reformer confidently announced that the true figure must be at least 100,000. Historians still argue about the accuracy, but one detail remains clear. London had a vast, unseen female workforce that powered an entire underground economy. But the women weren't a single group. They ranged across a spectrum that outsiders rarely bothered to understand. Streetwalkers, navigating danger with every step. Theater girls, lingering in balconies waiting for a gentleman's glance. Private mistresses, kept in tiny flats paid for by men who insisted they were respectable. Courtesans, whose influence reached the halls of Parliament. Domestic servants, pushed into scandal by circumstances they never chose. Each lived a version of the city shaped by different rules, opportunities, and constant grinding risk. A night at the edges. You turn a corner toward a more crowded stretch. Music spills from a pub door every time it swings open. Soldiers and sailors, half drunk and half homesick, cluster in loose groups. A woman walks confidently along the pavement, her skirt hitched to avoid the filth on the ground. Her smile flickers like a signal lantern, deliberate, practiced, protective. People often imagine that women in this trade were fearless or reckless or condemned, but most operated with the alertness of scouts behind enemy lines. They memorized escape routes. They recognized dangerous faces. They kept mental lists, men to trust, men to avoid, men who paid well, men who lied loudly. But the most striking thing is how quickly they could shift moods. A tense jaw transforms into a playful smirk. A guarded posture becomes inviting. A sharp glance softens into curiosity. These adjustments weren't signs of deceit. They were survival techniques honed by necessity. If you watch carefully, you'll see that no woman here moves without calculation. The city's strange double standard. What the respectable world refused to admit, or perhaps refused to see, was that these women were an essential part of how society actually worked. Men who preached morality on Sunday evenings snuck through side doors on Saturday nights. Clerks with modest wages saved coins for occasional indulgences. Aristocrats visited private rooms where their names were never written down. Policemen memorized faces, not simply to arrest them, but sometimes to bargain with them. And yet these women were portrayed as unfortunates, ruined girls, the city's shame. Victorian England managed a bizarre balancing act. It condemned prostitution loudly, while depending on it quietly. It preached purity while constructing entire districts where purity was neither expected nor profitable. It celebrated family values while creating a labor system that pushed countless young women into danger. This contradiction wasn't some side note. It was the heart of the era. The ritual of looking away. One of the strangest habits of the respectable classes was their absolute mastery of selective blindness. A gentleman walking home from a dinner party might spot a woman standing alone on a dark corner, her shawl thin, her face tired, and instantly adjust his gaze to the sky as if the clouds were suddenly fascinating. A well-to-do lady, upon seeing a girl too young to be wandering at that hour, would tighten her grip on her husband's arm and pretend the girl was a shadow, not a person. And yet those same households would read breathless newspaper accounts about vice in the city, shaking their heads in moral outrage as though the phenomenon had nothing to do with them. Silence was one of Victorian London's favorite tools. Everything was understood. Nothing was acknowledged. Everyone participated. No one confessed. Your first step into the hidden world. As you stand in the center of this half-lit street, the pieces begin to fall into place. The city is more than a setting. It is an active participant in the lives of these women. It shapes their decisions, threatens their safety, and offers fleeting opportunities wrapped in danger. And tonight, you're going deeper. You're stepping into the world of the women who navigated London's contradictions more intimately than anyone else. Those who lived in the narrow gap between survival and condemnation. This is only the beginning.
If Part 1 showed you the shadowy architecture of London's nights, Part 2 pulls you into the daylight, where the rules are stricter, the masks are prettier, and the consequences of a single mistake are far more brutal. Because the truth that Victorian England never admitted is this: most women who slipped into the city's nighttime economy didn't start there. They came from homes, from kitchens, from stables, from lofts that smelled of laundry steam and candle smoke. They came from families trying to stay afloat in a world designed to drown them. To understand the women of the night, you must first understand the women of the day. The servant system, a ladder with missing rungs. In Victorian London, nearly every respectable household, even modest ones, relied on domestic servants. Thousands of girls migrated from the countryside, believing the city would offer steady wages and safety. Instead, they found a strange paradox. They were expected to be invisible, yet held to impossibly high moral standards. Maids slept in cramped attic rooms, but were blamed for any impropriety in the house. Cooks were trusted with feeding entire families, but dismissed instantly if a rumor stained their reputation. Housemaids cleaned rooms belonging to men who felt entitled to their attention. Yet if a young woman became pregnant, she was the one thrown out. One wrong step, and a girl could tumble from respectable servant to streetwalker in a matter of hours. For some, that fall came from a moment of bad luck. For others, from force. For many, from the slow, grinding weight of poverty. But no matter what the cause, the descent was rarely straight down. It was more like slipping through cracks society refused to fill. The myth of female protection. Victorian families loved to insist that they protected their daughters. They protected them from learning about their own bodies. They protected them from handling their own money. They protected them from understanding the world's dangers. And this supposed protection often left girls completely defenseless. Many women entered the servant system with no understanding of how wages worked, no right to negotiate, and no legal protections. Their employers could dock pay, withhold letters, confiscate belongings, and even change their hours without explanation. Worst of all, a male employer's interest, whether mild, aggressive, or predatory, could destroy a girl's entire future. He suffered no consequences. She suffered all of them. If she became pregnant, she lost her job. If she complained, she was accused of seduction. If she ran away, she became a girl of the streets. Respectability was a tightrope, and the wind blew hard. The moment the door closes. Imagine this. A girl named Clara, age 17, arrives from a small village. She's shy but hardworking. She scrubs floors until her knuckles split and wakes before sunrise to prepare fires. Her employer praises her dedication. Then one evening, the master of the house follows her into the pantry. She tells him no. He insists. He doesn't need to raise his voice. His threats come in the form of gentleness, the most dangerous kind. If you tell anyone, you'll be dismissed. You won't find work in any house after that. She pushes him away. She runs. And the next morning, a note is waiting. Pack your belongings. Your services are no longer required. Her wages are withheld. Her references are ruined. And as she stands on the street with a single bag of clothing and no employer willing to take her, she becomes the exact thing society accused her of trying to escape. Clara didn't choose the street. The street chose the moment the world gave her no alternatives. Stories like hers weren't rare. They were common. People just didn't want to see them. The city's silent recruitment machine. Once a woman lost her reputation, London began shaping her path with eerie efficiency. She might try laundry work, which paid too little to survive. She might try factory work, dangerous, overcrowded, underpaid. She might try seamstress work, where 14-hour days earned pennies. Every honest option was a treadmill leading nowhere. But the night? The night offered coins in minutes that the daylight refused in weeks. A drink in a pub could turn into a proposition. A chance meeting could become a temporary arrangement. A regular patron could provide lodging. A woman could regain a small sense of control, even if only for a moment. The city didn't lure women into prostitution through desire. It pushed them through desperation. Respectable by day, condemned by night. One of the strangest truths of Victorian morality is how many women lived double lives. It wasn't just courtesans with expensive gowns. Even the girl who sold matches or flowers in the daylight might have a second income after sunset. This wasn't because she wanted excitement. It was because bread cost money, rent cost money, coal cost money, survival cost money. Sometimes a woman might exchange companionship for a meal. Sometimes she might accept help from a man who asked for something in return. Sometimes she earned enough at night to keep her siblings fed back in the countryside. Victorians called these women fallen. But fallen from what? From a system that never let them climb to begin with? the spectrum no one wanted to admit. The city didn't draw a neat line between moral women and immoral women. Instead, there was a spectrum, fluid, varied, and far more complicated than the newspapers ever admitted. There were women who took clients only in emergencies, women who saw the same man for years, women who negotiated like business professionals, women who worked in small groups for safety, women who balanced childcare with nighttime labor, women who returned to serving jobs and hid their pasts, women who moved in and out of the trade depending on the season. Yet society insisted on labeling them all with a single word: prostitute, as if their entire being could be collapsed into one stigmatized identity. This simplification didn't just erase nuance. It intentionally hid the economic engine driving everything. It allowed the wealthy to pretend they weren't complicit. It allowed the middle class to maintain moral superiority. It allowed the government to blame individuals instead of poverty. The reality behind closed curtains. There's a widely repeated Victorian fantasy that every woman who sold sex did so in alleys or public houses. In reality, many transactions happened in places the respectable world pretended were pure. Private rooms above shops, apartments rented by rich men, cheap hotels near train stations, bakeries after closing, tailor shops, even parlor rooms in houses where the family was away. The city's moral geography wasn't divided by neighborhood, it was divided by secrets. Behind closed curtains, deals unfolded that would shock the very people who lived in those neighborhoods, only if they chose to look, and they rarely did. A city built on denial. This is the core contradiction of Victorian London. It designed a world where women had few paths to stability, then punished them for taking the ones society refused to provide. It preached chastity, while building entire economies around its absence. It adored pure women, while creating conditions where purity was impossible. And somehow, through all of this, the city still insisted on seeing itself as morally superior to the people it exploited.
If nighttime in Victorian London was a swirling storm of shadows, then the police were its uneasy weather forecasters, never quite sure whether to calm the skies or ignite them. Their presence felt both everywhere and nowhere, an inconsistent force that could descend upon a woman at any moment or ignore the most blatant crimes happening right beside them. To understand the danger women faced in this era, you must see how the law worked and how it didn't, because the truth is unsettling. Victorian policing wasn't designed to protect vulnerable women. It was designed to maintain the illusion of order, and illusions always demand someone else's sacrifice. The policeman's lantern. Picture this. A constable walks his nightly beat along a narrow lane. His boots splash through puddles. His breath fogs in the cold air. He carries a truncheon at his belt and a lantern that casts more shadow than light. He sees a woman leaning against the brick wall. Maybe she's tired. Maybe she's in pain. Maybe she's waiting for a friend. Or maybe she's hoping to earn enough coins to buy breakfast in the morning. But the policeman doesn't care about her circumstances. He cares about whether she looks like a problem. If he decides she does, he can order her to move along. If she don't move fast enough, he can arrest her. If she protests, he can claim she's disorderly. If she tries to explain herself, he can accuse her of loitering for immoral purposes. Her fate hangs not on what she's done, but on what he chooses to see. This is the foundation of Victorian justice. One man's judgment, one moment's mood, one woman's entire life at stake. The strange dance between police and poverty. For many constables, the nightly interactions with women weren't about law-breaking. They were about negotiation, power, and survival on both sides. A woman might offer information about violent clients. A policeman might warn her if a raid was coming. Some turned a blind eye in exchange for silence or favors. Others harassed the same women nightly to assert dominance. It wasn't formal corruption. It was the far more common Victorian version, unspoken arrangements. To stay safe, many women memorized the rhythms of the officers' patrols. When they walked past the factories, which ones were lenient, which ones drank too much, which ones believed women in the trade deserved cruelty, which ones might help if a client became violent. Knowledge wasn't just helpful, it meant survival. A law that treated women as evidence. Perhaps the harshest reality of the era was this: women weren't seen as citizens. They weren't seen as workers. They weren't even seen as victims. They were seen as potential sources of infection. In the mid-19th century, as fears of disease spread through the military, Parliament passed a set of harsh laws that allowed police to detain any woman they merely suspected of being a prostitute. No trial, no evidence, just suspicion. A woman could be forced into a medical examination. If she refused, she could be imprisoned. If she complied and failed the exam, she could be locked in a hospital for months. This system destroyed countless lives, and yet the public accepted it because the laws were framed as protecting men, not protecting women, not protecting health, protecting men. Women's bodies were seen as public property. Men's bodies were seen as national assets. The hypocrisy could not have been clearer. And the streets where the law forgot to look. And yet, despite the moral panic, women walked into far more danger from lack of policing than over-policing. There were alleys where constables rarely went, too narrow, too dim, too troublesome. There were sections of the docks where violence was so frequent that officers treated injuries as inconveniences rather than crimes. There were entire neighborhoods where women learned that shouting for help was useless. Even when a woman did report an assault, the police often responded with disbelief. What were you doing out alone? Why were you in that area? Why did you speak to him? Did you encourage him? Did you provoke him? The burden of proof always fell on the woman, even when she was bleeding, frightened, or half-conscious. Victorian law demanded that women be perfect victims in order to deserve protection. But no one can be perfect when living a life so precarious. The men who hid behind uniforms. Some officers saw women as nuisances. Others saw them as opportunities. A few saw them as human beings, but those officers were rare and usually powerless to change anything. It wasn't uncommon for women to be pressured into providing information, paying small bribes, offering favors, or enduring harassment in exchange for being left alone. Imagine being told that your safety depended not on laws, but on pleasing the men who enforced them. Imagine knowing that the people sworn to protect the city were just as dangerous as the men who lurked in its alleys. Women weren't afraid of one villain. They were afraid of multiple forms of power closing in on them, all wearing different disguises. A system already decided against them. Courtrooms were no better. If a woman appeared before a magistrate, her guilt was often assumed before she opened a mouth. Respectability mattered more than truth. If she had no husband, she was suspicious. If she had no employment, she was improper. If she had nice clothing, she was extravagant. If she had shabby clothing, she was destitute and prone to vice. There was no winning. Even language betrayed them. Newspapers used terms like disorderly women, abandoned creatures, public nuisances. And these labels made it easier for society to ignore the real dangers these women faced: poverty, violence, hunger, disease, and systemic bias. Women weren't just judged for what they did, they were judged for what they might do. The illusion of moral authority. Victorian officials loved to present themselves as protectors of social purity, but scratch beneath the surface, and a very different truth emerged. The law wasn't there to defend morality. It was there to defend reputation. Officials cared more about preventing scandals than preventing violence.
They cared more about maintaining appearances than improving lives. They cared more about controlling women's behavior than addressing the conditions that created vulnerability. And women sensed this. They learned to avoid certain streets. They learned which pubs were safe. They learned which boarding houses looked respectable on the outside, but were traps inside. They learned that a policeman's footsteps could mean rescue or ruin. The law wasn't a shield. It was a spinning coin, one that too often landed on its edge. The beginning of resistance. What makes this era so extraordinary is that women didn't quietly accept their fate. Some fought back, loudly, strategically, relentlessly. Activists, writers, and even former prostitutes began speaking publicly about the injustice they faced. Middle-class women joined campaigns to repeal laws that targeted the poor. Journalists exposed police abuse. Charity groups demanded investigations. Out of this chaos grew the earliest forms of social advocacy for women's rights. Victorian society tried to silence women, but the women learned something dangerous. Silence itself was a weapon, and they could choose not to use it.
If you stand on a London street long enough for the night air to settle around you and the fog to roll in like a slow-moving tide, you start to realize something important. This city wasn't powered only by factories, shipping, and trade. It was powered by need. Need for warmth, need for survival, need for escape, need for connection, even brief, even paid for, even dangerous. Victorian London built grand museums, political institutions, glittering theaters, and fashionable districts. But behind all that splendor was a massive, unofficial industry that kept thousands fed. And the polite world insisted on pretending it didn't exist. The currency of the night. Coins moved differently after dark. Coins passed from hand to hand with the quiet urgency of secrets. A woman might earn in one evening what a factory girl earned in a week. A sailor might spend half a month's pay in one night on comfort he couldn't find anywhere else. A clerk who earned almost nothing could still scrape together enough for a few stolen hours. This imbalance created a strange cycle. Men earned the city's wages. Women earned the city's loneliness. But don't mistake loneliness for romance. This was an economy built on survival, an exchange forged out of necessity, not fantasy. Many transactions weren't even primarily sexual. Some men simply wanted company, someone to talk to, someone who would listen without judgment. Others wanted to escape the strict social hierarchy that defined every waking moment of their lives. And some wanted intimacy without responsibility, the luxury of leaving their problems behind when the night ended. Women understood this better than anyone. They became interpreters of male insecurity, negotiators of desire, curators of illusion. They shaped the night the way merchants shaped their stalls, adjusting tone, posture, clothing, even personality, depending on who stood before them. This adaptability was a skill, one that society refused to acknowledge as labor. The price of warmth. To understand this economy, imagine a winter night in Spitalfields. The wind slices between buildings like a blade. The streets are slick with soot and puddles that reflect the faint glow of gas lamps. Most shops have closed, but pubs still pulse with noise, their doors exhaling the smell of beer, smoke, and sweat. A woman named Lottie stands outside one such pub, her shoulders hunched against the cold. She hasn't eaten since morning. She can't return to her lodging house without paying for her bed, a fee collected nightly
not monthly. So she waits. Eventually, a man exits the pub, coat collar turned up. She glances at him. She tilts her head slightly. Not a smile, not a promise, just a sign of willingness. A brief conversation follows. A price is agreed. They leave together. The coins she earns tonight will pay for her bed, half a loaf of bread, a few hours of warmth, a morning cup of tea. This isn't luxury. This isn't greed. This is survival economics. Lottie isn't a seductress. She isn't immoral. She's a woman who has learned how to stay alive. The hidden costs. Every trade has overhead. Every job has risks. But for women in the nighttime economy, the costs were brutal. Clothing. A woman needed to look presentable, not to attract men, but to avoid police suspicion. Respectable clothing was expensive, and many women went into debt to maintain appearances. Lodging. Cheap boarding rooms charged by the night, trapping women in a perpetual cycle of unstable housing. Health. The cold wore down their lungs. Violence left scars. Illness could end everything overnight. Safety. A woman often had no companion, no guard, no one to defend her if a client turned dangerous. Reputation. Even if she wanted regular work again, no employer would take her without references. This economy wasn't a choice. It was a corner, backed by walls. The men who profited the most. While society blamed women for the moral decay, it conveniently ignored the men who benefited from their labor. Landlords. They charged inflated prices for filthy rooms. Pub owners. They relied on the presence of women to attract male customers. Clothing shops. They profited from constant purchases of essential garments. Police officers. Some demanded bribes or favors in exchange for leniency. Brothel keepers. They took cuts of women's earnings while offering dubious protection. Gentlemen. The wealthiest men enjoyed the services of courtesans, elegantly dressed, educated women kept in apartments paid for by their benefactors. Even politicians took advantage of the system, condemning prostitution publicly while privately supporting the very women they criminalized. Victorian society wasn't divided between the pure and the fallen. It was divided between those who profited from hypocrisy and those crushed by it. When desire becomes a market. What makes this era so intriguing is how openly economics shaped intimacy. Some wealthy men sought courtesans not because they wanted novelty, but because they wanted freedom. A courtesan didn't require emotional labor. She didn't demand fidelity. She didn't judge. These women were well-read and skilled in conversation. They were treated better by their clients than by society. Men praised their beauty, intelligence, and charm behind closed doors. In public, they reduced them to stereotypes. But courtesans weren't naive. They studied politics, fashion, literature, and the subtleties of power. Some became incredibly successful, able to afford fine clothing, servants, and their own apartments. Yet their status remained fragile. Wealth couldn't buy respectability. If their patron lost interest or money, their entire lifestyle could collapse within days. Victorian women navigated gilded cages. Poor women navigated crumbling streets, but both lived under the same relentless truth. Men controlled the economy of desire. Women paid the price. The other side of the transaction. For many men, especially from lower classes, visiting a prostitute wasn't just about sex. It was one of the only ways they could momentarily escape the rigid social structure that governed their whole lives. In that brief encounter, they could speak freely, laugh without restraint, forget the factory, forget the hierarchy, forget the crushing sense of invisibility. For an hour, they felt like someone. Women understood this. They didn't just sell intimacy, they sold relief. They sold acknowledgement. They sold a mirror in which a man could see himself differently. This wasn't exploitation. It was survival meeting survival. Two lives colliding in temporary solidarity. The fragility of the whole system. Despite its economic importance, the nighttime economy was incredibly unstable. Police raids could destroy a street's livelihood overnight. Landlords could evict entire buildings of women for political appearances. Moral reformers could push neighborhoods into sudden collapse. The market thrived in secrecy and died in exposure. Women lived always one heartbeat away from disaster. And yet, they kept going. They adapted. They moved. They learned new territories. They rebuilt networks. Because without this hidden economy, thousands of people, both men and women, would have starved. Victorian London wanted to enjoy its pleasures without acknowledging the labor behind them. It wanted intimacy without responsibility, comfort without cost, desire without consequence. But women always paid the bill.
Every city has two maps. One is the official one, the kind printed in atlases, framed in libraries, taught to school children. It shows tidy streets, labeled districts, important institutions. It suggests order, structure, predictability. The other map, the real map, lives only in the bodies of the people who move through the city after dark. It exists in instincts, memories, warnings, scars, whispered advice passed between women who understand that geography is not just physical. It's emotional, it's dangerous, it's alive. Victorian London's unofficial map could never fit between the pages of a book. It shifted constantly, depending on the weather, the police patrols, the clientele, the temper of a neighborhood, or the rumor of a violent man on the loose. Women didn't follow streets. They followed survival routes. And each route was marked not by landmarks, but by risks. The streets with names everyone knew. Some streets were famous. Not officially, of course, but in the way that matters most, by their reputation. Ratcliffe Highway, Whitechapel Road, Drury Lane, Lambeth Marsh. Each one pulsed with a different kind of energy. Ratcliffe Highway thrummed with sailors pouring off ships after months at sea. Their pockets were full, but their tempers were unpredictable. Women who worked this district developed special strategies, how to negotiate quickly, how to spot foreign sailors who didn't speak English, how to defuse alcohol-fueled aggression before it turned violent. Whitechapel Road was denser, more chaotic, a mix of immigrants, laborers, beggars, thieves, and people simply trying to survive another day. Women here relied on sharp awareness and an almost clairvoyant sense of danger. Drury Lane attracted actors, musicians, writers, a more eccentric clientele, but no safer. Creativity did not soften desperation. Lambeth Marsh was different altogether. Darker, quieter, easier to disappear in, whether you wanted to or not. These streets were legendary not because they were glamorous, but because they left marks on the lives of everyone who walked them. The alleys no woman walked alone. The true heart of danger wasn't the main roads, it was the alleys. Narrow, twisting passages where sound didn't carry, and gas lamps sputtered like dying stars. Women knew which alleys held drunks, thieves, men who wanted violence, not companionship, men who waited for someone desperate enough to take a risk, men who pretended to be clients but were something far worse. Women memorized these spaces with the same urgency sailors memorized ocean currents. If you took a wrong turn on a foggy night, the city swallowed you. Some alleys earned nicknames based on terrible events: Black Widow's Cut, Knife Row, Little Murder Lane. These weren't exaggerations, they were warnings. A new woman learned these names quickly, not through lectures, but through late-night advice shared in doorways and tavern corners. Don't go down that one after midnight. Don't talk to the man who waits by the butcher's shop. Don't ever follow a client into a dead-end alley. If the fog rolls in thick, go home. There's no safety in fog. This knowledge wasn't paranoia, it was survival curriculum. The safe houses that weren't safe. Women often mentioned safe houses, but the term was misleading. A safe house wasn't safe. It was safer, and that difference mattered. These were lodging houses with night managers who intervened when clients grew violent, pubs where the owner had a soft spot for certain women, brothels with strict rules about clients, apartments where several women watched out for each other. These places formed a protective web, thin, fragile, easily torn. A new owner could ruin a safe house in a day. A police raid could scatter its residents. A violent client could unravel the fragile trust that held the place together. But even the illusion of safety was precious. A warm hearth, a cup of tea, a moment to breathe, a room with a lock that actually worked. In a world built on uncertainty, those moments meant everything. The dangerous promise of carriages. Carriages were symbols of wealth and romance in paintings and novels, but for women working the streets, carriages were traps on wheels. A carriage meant a man who didn't want to be seen, a confined space, a driver loyal to the client, not the woman, doors that locked from the outside, a moving vehicle that could go anywhere, including the outskirts where no one could hear you. Women developed strategies for this, too, checking if the door could be opened from inside, leaning slightly out before entering in case they needed to jump, noting the driver's face, memorizing the route. Some refused carriages entirely. Others accepted them only out of desperation, because while danger lurked everywhere, hunger had its own voice, and sometimes it drowned out caution. The docks were a world unto themselves. Few places carried more danger than the docks. At night, the docks were a different species of place, noisy, chaotic, and charged with unpredictable energy. Workers hauled crates under lanterns. Ships creaked ominously as they rocked in the river. Groups of men shouted in dozens of languages. Bars overflowed with drunken sailors who hadn't seen a woman in months. Women who worked the docks had to negotiate with groups, not individuals, avoid men who traveled in packs, watch for foreign sailors with no idea of local customs, detect hostility through body language, not words, know which ships were notorious. But the docks also offered money, quick, heavy, unburdened money. A woman could earn enough in 3 hours at the docks to pay for a week's rent, and that lure was powerful. The rooms no one discussed. Perhaps the most ominous spaces of all were the private rooms. A locked door, a stranger, no witnesses. Some rooms were fine, dusty, cramped, cold, but uneventful. Others were nightmares waiting to unfold. Women learned to read a room instantly. Is the furniture pushed aside? Is the window nailed shut? Is the client too calm? Are there tools on the table that shouldn't be there? Does the room feel rehearsed, like it's seen fear before? Instincts became sixth senses. The women who ignored them often didn't get a second chance. The city as a living predator. The most remarkable thing about Victorian London is how alive it felt. Not alive like a garden or a park, alive like a predator, heavy, silent, watching. You could sense its moods. Some nights the fog hid danger. Some nights the moon exposed things better left unseen. Some nights the cold made men cruel. Some nights the heat made tempers flare. Women adapted, adjusted, improvised. They learned the city's breathing patterns. They learned which nights were safe. They learned when to trust intuition, when to trust each other, when to trust no one. And they learned that danger was not an exception. It was the landscape. A map written in memory, not ink. The true map of Victorian London wasn't found in books. It was carried in women's footsteps, etched into their routines, buried in their survival stories. Only they understood the city's real borders, between safety and risk, between warmth and hunger, between life and disappearance. Victorian London wasn't just a place, it was a shifting labyrinth, and only the women who walked the nights could read it.
People often imagine that Victorian London's dangers were obvious. Thugs in alleys, drunken sailors, pickpockets with quick fingers. But the worst predators were rarely so visible. They moved quietly, confidently, and with an unsettling sense of entitlement. Because the most frightening truth of the era was this: the city wasn't just dangerous because of darkness. It was dangerous because certain men believed the darkness made them untouchable. Women weren't afraid of shadows. They were afraid of the men who used them. The myths that hid monsters. Victorian society adored myths. It liked to believe that violent men came only from the lowest classes: dock workers, thieves, foreigners, drifters. Newspapers painted them as wild creatures, incapable of civilization. But the truth women whispered among themselves was very different. Some of the most dangerous clients were well-dressed men, respectable businessmen, clerks who smiled too politely, doctors with cold eyes, gentlemen who tipped generously but grew strange behind closed doors. A wealthy man could disappear into the night with no suspicion. A poor man was noticed instantly. Predators understood this imbalance. They used it. And women, despite every skill and instinct, could be caught off guard. When charm became a weapon. The most dangerous men didn't start with threats. They started with charm. A friendly tone, a warm smile, a flattering remark, a generous offer. Charm disarmed women's instincts, not because women were naive, but because charm disguised intention. A man who seemed kind could turn cruel in an instant. A man who seemed gentle could become violent the moment he felt in control. A man who seemed nervous could become terrifying once the door closed. Women learned to mistrust kindness. Kindness had teeth. The rooms where screams didn't matter. The tragedy of Victorian architecture is how easily sound vanished into brick. You could scream in a room above a shop and no one would hear. You could cry out in a boarding house and people would pull pillows over their heads. You could beg for help from an upstairs window, and passers-by would assume it was a drunken quarrel. The city wasn't deaf. It chose not to listen. Women understood that if a client crossed the line, there was no cavalry coming, no officer rushing in, no neighbor intervening. Their safety depended entirely on their instincts, their quick thinking, their ability to read danger, their willingness to run. And sometimes, none of that was enough. The men who wanted more than control. Some predators weren't satisfied with intimidation. Some wanted to test boundaries, to humiliate, to frighten, to see how far they could push without consequence. These men treated violence like experimentation, a tug that became a yank, a threat disguised as a joke, a hand that lingered too long around a woman's throat, a request that sounded harmless until it wasn't. Women learned to sense escalation, the subtle shift in a man's tone, the tightening of his jaw, the sudden stillness that meant something was about to change. Survival meant noticing these moments before it was too late. The fog, a killer without a knife. Fog was beautiful in paintings, but to women at night, fog was terror made visible. Thick fog swallowed everything: landmarks, footsteps, voices, help. It erased the world beyond an arm's length. Predators loved fog. They could follow a woman silently, wait until she turned the wrong street, approach from angles she couldn't anticipate. Women told each other, if the fog rolls in fast, go home. No coin is worth a foggy night. You disappear more easily in fog than in darkness. Fog was the perfect accomplice. The men no one warned about. Some predators weren't strangers. They were familiar clients, men who seemed safe for weeks, even months, until something inside them fractured. Alcohol often cracked the mask. Jealousy shattered it. Humiliation broke it completely. A man who felt inferior in his daily life might explode when faced with a woman who didn't fear him. A man who felt powerless at work might become violent when he realized he couldn't buy the intimacy he wanted. A man who mistook comfort for affection might lash out when reminded that a paid encounter wasn't love. These shifts were sudden, violent, unpredictable. Women lived with the knowledge that even routine could betray them. The stories women told each other. Information was the only real weapon women had. They shared warnings like lifelines. The tall man with the silver cane, avoid him. The one who says he's a doctor, don't go with him alone. The man who smells like lavender soap is dangerous when drunk. The one who offers extra money to go somewhere quiet, never agree. These warnings formed an underground intelligence network, far more effective than anything the police ever built. Women trusted each other more than they trusted the law, because unlike the law, other women cared if they lived. The disappearances no one investigated. If a woman went missing, no one asked questions. Lodging house owners assumed she failed to pay rent. Police assumed she traveled. Newspapers ignored her. Churches didn't mention her. Families, if they knew, grieved silently. A woman could vanish without leaving a ripple, and predators knew that too. Some men took advantage of that void. They targeted women whose disappearances would draw no attention. Women without family, women without steady lodging, women already pushed out of society. Victorian London created the perfect hunting ground. A population of vulnerable women, unprotected and unseen. Courage that did not look like heroism. Despite everything, women continued to walk the streets. Not because they were reckless, not because they sought danger, but because survival demanded it. Courage in this world didn't look like charging into battle. It looked like showing up night after night, trusting instincts sharpened by trauma, learning to escape situations without looking afraid, laughing with friends even when fear clung to their ribs, finding warmth where they could, protecting strangers because no one else would. This wasn't cowardice. This was a bravery forged in fire, a bravery the world never recognized. The darkness that took and the darkness that protected. Strangely, the night wasn't always the enemy. Some darkness hid danger, but some darkness hid women from danger. Women used shadows to avoid police, to slip away from violent men, to find safety in numbers, to control their visibility. The night wasn't a villain, it was a landscape. What made the night deadly wasn't the absence of light, it was the presence of those who believed darkness excused anything.
If the streets of Victorian London were alive at night, the newspapers were alive at dawn. They clattered into the world before breakfast, ink still damp, filled with stories carefully chosen to excite, terrify, and instruct their readers. And Londoners devoured them. But the news didn't simply report reality, it created it. It shaped opinions, fueled fears, created villains, and blurred the line between truth and spectacle. The city that women navigated by night was dangerous enough, but the version of it described in print was something else entirely. A theater, a warning, a morality lesson, a performance designed to keep the public entertained while reinforcing the social order. And the women of the night were the media's favorite characters. The making of a fallen woman. Victorian journalism loved that phrase, fallen woman. It rolled off the tongue with a mixture of pity and condemnation. Nothing in the term acknowledged poverty, violence, lack of protection, or limited choices. A fallen woman was framed as someone who had slipped from an imaginary pedestal, one that society insisted all women could remain on with enough virtue. The newspapers were obsessed with them, not as people, but as symbols. They appeared in stories like tragic morality tales, cautionary warnings for young women, scandalous gossip columns, crime reports dripping with innuendo, sermon-like essays about sin and redemption. And every article followed the same script. Step 1. Describe the woman as once innocent. Step 2. Hint she made a single misstep. Step 3. Suggest that misstep led to ruin. Step 4. Blame her for the consequences. Step 5. Use her story as proof that the city was morally collapsing. It didn't matter whether the details were true. Victorians wanted drama, and the press delivered. Sensationalism sells, especially when it's cruel. Panic sold peepers. So did misery. So did crime. And newspapers learned quickly that stories about sex, danger, and women of the night were irresistible. Even minor incidents, a drunken scuffle, a domestic dispute, a woman fainting from hunger, could become moral decay in Whitechapel, shocking display of female depravity, another victim of her own vices. The stories were embellished, exaggerated, sometimes outright invented. A minor altercation became a brawl. A disagreement became a riot. A robbery became a spate of lawlessness. A woman defending herself became an uncontrollable creature. The press used women's struggles as entertainment, and worse, the public rewarded them for it. the respectable readers who pretended to be outraged. Upper and middle-class families read these stories with a mix of horror and fascination. They shook their heads, tutted loudly, and declared society was decaying, while secretly craving the next scandal. Respectable women clutched their pearls as they devoured every detail. Respectable men condemned vice while reading every sordid line twice. But the most striking part, they believed they weren't participating. They believed they were mere observers, spectators, judges. But by consuming sensationalized stories, they became complicit in creating a city defined by moral panic rather than truth. The women in these stories weren't symbols of moral decline. They were human beings, but the press rarely saw them that way. The birth of the monster narrative. Whenever crimes were committed against women of the night, the newspapers responded with grotesque fascination. They created caricatures of criminals, monstrous, almost supernatural villains, lurking in alleys, hunting the innocent and fallen alike. This narrative served several purposes. It shifted blame. Violence wasn't a product of poverty, desperation, or social neglect. It was blamed on mythical fiends. It comforted readers. If the violence came from monsters, not men, then society didn't need to question its own failings. It created heroes. The press praised police efforts even when investigations were sloppy or indifferent. It reinforced stereotypes. Women of the night were portrayed as either tragic victims or reckless temptresses, nothing in between. The city became a stage. The criminals became creatures. The women became props. Reality vanished beneath the ink. The moral journalists who wanted to save the world. Not all journalists wrote with cruelty. A small but powerful group of reform-minded writers saw through the hypocrisy. They went into poor neighborhoods, visited lodging houses, and actually spoke with the women the newspapers reduced to caricatures. They wrote about unsanitary conditions, police harassment, predatory landlords, unsafe workhouses, lack of education, hunger, fear, vulnerability, strength, community. They described women as humans, complex, intelligent, resilient. Some wrote anonymously to avoid backlash. Others were fired for being too sympathetic. A few kept pushing, determined to expose the truth. These journalists didn't stop the tide of sensationalism, but they carved small cracks in it, cracks that would, years later, expand into full-fledged advocacy. The public's strange addiction to fear. Victorians had a complicated relationship with fear. They claimed to hate it, yet they consumed it constantly. Serial stories about crime were printed in installments. People waited eagerly for the next chapter of grisly murders, anonymous letters, shadowy figures. Fear became a form of entertainment. Women walking alone didn't make people fear for women's safety. They made people fear the idea of urban chaos. Crime in the slums didn't inspire empathy. It inspired anxiety about the poor rising up. Violence against prostitutes didn't horrify the public. It allowed them to congratulate themselves on being respectable. The city's violence wasn't a tragedy. It was a spectacle. When the headlines became a mirror. What the newspapers didn't intend, but inevitably caused, was a deeper awareness of the city's cracks. Every exaggerated report, every sensational title, every scandalous tale revealed something the public didn't want to acknowledge. The city was unstable. Its moral system was fragile. Its institutions were inconsistent. Its divides were widening. Its women were suffering.
Its men were indulging without shame. Its police were overwhelmed. Its public was addicted to fear. The city inside the headlines was distorted, but it was also, in many ways, painfully accurate. The stories were wrong. The implications were right. Women of the night read newspapers too. They saw themselves described as unfortunate creatures, wretched remnants of society, pitiful examples of moral ruin. They laughed at the exaggerations. They scoffed at the melodrama. They rolled their eyes at the moral lectures. But sometimes they read stories about women found dead in alleys, their bodies described with lurid detail. And those articles weren't funny. Those articles weren't sensational. Those articles were warnings. Women recognized the names, or the descriptions, or the street corners. The media didn't intend to create communication between women, but it did. The newspapers became an accidental network of alerts, danger reports, and grim reminders that the city's predators moved freely. The city that became a story. By the late 1800s, London wasn't just a city. It was a narrative, a character, a monster, a mystery, a spectacle. People didn't just live in it, they consumed it. And as the press continued to churn out stories, the divide between the printed city and the real city grew. Women of the night lived in the real one, cold, hungry, dangerous, cruel, alive. Readers lived in the printed one, thrilling, shocking, sinful, exaggerated, safe. And the gap between the two would shape history.
When people imagined Victorian London, they often picture rigid rules and stiff etiquette. But beneath all that formality lay something far more fluid: identity. Women who walked the nighttime streets mastered the art of reinvention like seasoned performers, not because they enjoyed deception, but because identity was the one thing the world constantly tried to take from them. Respectable society insisted on giving women one of two labels: pure or fallen. Nothing in between. Nothing nuanced, nothing honest. But women refused to live inside these narrow categories. They created new identities for themselves, not out of vanity, but out of survival. And these identities shifted depending on the hour, the company, the neighborhood, or the danger. To navigate Victorian London was to become an actress, a strategist, and a chameleon, all while carrying the weight of hunger, fear, and exhaustion. The masks weren't lies. They were armor. The daytime version of a woman. By daylight, a woman could be anyone, and that illusion alone kept her alive. Take a woman like Ellen. In the morning, she might walk through a market with her shawl neatly arranged, her expression modest, her steps careful. Shopkeepers would greet her politely. Mothers would nod to her. Children would brush past without suspicion. No one would guess she spent the night in the alleys of Spitalfields. Respectability wasn't earned, it was performed. And the performance was simple: lowered eyes, measured footsteps, a tidy appearance no matter how frayed the clothing, hands held close to the body, a demeanor that suggested a woman with somewhere respectable to be. In daylight, no one questioned her. In daylight, she blended in. Identity was a cloak she put on with the sunrise. Names were not fixed, they were tools. At night, names became fluid. A woman might use one name for regulars, another for police, another for strangers, another still for the landlady. These weren't attempts at deception, they were shields. A name could protect her family from shame. A name could hide her from a violent man. A name could distance her real self from the work she had to do. A name could make her feel like she had control over something, even if everything else was unstable. Some women used initials. Some used nicknames given by friends. Some used names of actresses or characters from popular novels. Some used simple, soft names chosen for safety. Mary, Annie, Rose. A name wasn't an anchor, it was a lifeline. Appearance as a language. Clothing in Victorian London wasn't just fabric, it was communication. Women adjusted their appearance constantly to signal intention, availability, or caution. A hairstyle shift, a shawl color, a pinned skirt, or a pair of worn gloves could send different messages. A woman learned to read these signals like coded messages. A bright ribbon meant availability for new clients. A darker one meant she needed money urgently. A shawl pulled over the head meant, "Don't approach me, danger nearby." A skirt hem lifted slightly meant she was open to negotiation. A stern, rigid posture meant she was warding off an unwanted follower. Clothing wasn't vanity, it was survival dialect. Women spoke entire sentences through gestures most men never noticed. The private self, even hidden from friends. One of the loneliest truths of the era was that many women did not reveal their true selves to anyone, not even to their closest companions. To survive the night, a woman needed a hard shell. To survive the day, she needed a softer one. And somewhere deep inside, hidden beneath both, lived her real identity, her real fears, her real dreams, her real history. Some women had children they never spoke of. Some had families who believed they worked in shops or laundries. Some were widows, afraid of being labeled immoral. Some were runaways, escaping cruelty. Some were simply exhausted. But to reveal the full truth, even to a friend, was dangerous. Trust could save your life, but it could also expose you. So women lived with layered selves, each version of themselves designed for a different purpose. Identity became a house with many locked rooms.
The client's versions of women. Men didn't see the real women either. Each man constructed his own fantasy. To one man, she was an escape from his marriage. To another, she was a confidant he paid to listen. To another, she was a short-lived adventure. To another, she was a symbol of his power. To another, she was invisible before and after the encounter. The tragedy was that none of these versions saw her as a full person. Yet women learned to play along, not to humor, but to protect themselves. Every man encountered a version of a woman designed to give him exactly what he expected, so the night would pass safely for her. To survive, a woman let men believe their fantasy identities were true. Her real identity stayed hidden in a place even she sometimes forgot. The identity women wished they could claim. Ask these women, truly ask them, and most would tell you that their dream identity wasn't extraordinary. Not wealthy, not powerful, not glamorous, just safe. They dreamed of being a housekeeper in a quiet home, a seamstress with steady work, a woman who could walk at night without fear, a mother who could feed her children, a wife who wasn't judged, a shopkeeper with her own lockbox of coins, a woman with privacy and dignity. Their dreams weren't grand, they were human. But the world offered them roles too small, too cruel, too unforgiving. So they crafted new ones. 2 lives, 1 body. Every woman in the nighttime world lived a double life. One life for the city, sharp, quick, fearless, strategic. One life for herself, quiet, sad, hopeful, afraid. The dual lives weren't a choice, they were a necessity. A woman might joke loudly in a pub at midnight, but at dawn she might cry silently in her room. A woman might flirt boldly with strangers, but her heart might belong to someone who never knew her truth.
A woman might appear hardened, confident, unstoppable, but she might collapse from exhaustion the moment she was alone. Identity was both shield and burden. Two lives in one body, two masks for one fragile soul. Reinvention as a form of resistance. Women didn't just adapt, they resisted. They reinvented themselves because society refused to see them properly. Every identity they created was a rebellion against the belief that women were either pure or ruined, against the notion that poverty defined character, against the moral hypocrisy of the era, against the idea that their lives didn't matter. Every time a woman chose a new name, adjusted her clothing, or adopted a new persona, she was rewriting the rules forced upon her. She was claiming power, small, fleeting, but real. Identity became resistance. Resistance became survival. The mask that slipped too easily. But there were nights when the performance faltered. A sudden memory, a moment of vulnerability, a familiar face appearing unexpectedly, a gesture that reminded her of someone she loved, or a cruel word that cut too deeply. Suddenly the mask slipped. The real woman showed for just a heartbeat, a tremor in her voice, a flicker of fear, a flash of sorrow, a softness never meant for strangers. But the world wasn't kind to unmasked women. So she collected herself, rebuilt the persona, and stepped back into the role. The mask was fragile, but it was all she had. In the end, identity was a story a woman wrote for herself, a story others tried to rewrite, a story shaped by hunger, danger, and resilience, a story always at war with the city's gaze. Victorian London was obsessed with labeling women, but the truth was simple. Women were not their labels. They were not their circumstances. They were not their pasts. They were stories, complicated, shifting, unfinished stories. And every night, they added another chapter.
Victorian London was a city built on divisions: class, gender, wealth, respectability, geography, even the very hours of the day. The polite world spent its energy separating people into boxes, but the women who walked the nighttime streets learned a different truth. No one survives alone. The city wasn't just dangerous because of the men who roamed its shadows. It was dangerous because it isolated the poor, blamed the vulnerable, and ignored the suffering of those with no power. Women responded by creating something the city could never fully understand or destroy: a network of alliances, a web of quiet solidarity, a sisterhood forged in hardship. These bonds weren't formal and they weren't perfect, but they held women together when the world insisted they be disposable. And without these friendships, many wouldn't have made it through a single winter. Friendships born in doorways and taverns. Some friendships began the same way most survival stories do: accidentally. Two women waiting in the cold outside a pub, a shared glance on a dangerous street, a piece of bread given from one to another, a warning whispered about a violent client, a joke told to ease tension, a warmth shared on a night too bitter to face alone. Small moments became connections. Connections became trust. Trust became life-saving loyalty. In a world where the police weren't protectors and society was hostile, women became each other's safety nets. They watched for danger. They memorized each other's schedules. They waited for each other to return at dawn.
They pooled coins to buy food. They shared blankets in freezing rooms. Friendship wasn't sentimental. It was practical. It was necessary. It was sacred. The emotion beneath the toughness. Outsiders imagined these women as hardened, cynical, almost emotionless. But that assumption said more about society's coldness than theirs. Behind locked doors and closed curtains, women talked honestly, sometimes painfully, about homes they missed, children they couldn't support, parents who believed they worked as seamstresses, lovers who abandoned them, hunger that gnawed at their stomachs, dreams they still carried in fragile pieces. They weren't stone. They weren't cruel. They weren't indifferent. They were human, deeply vulnerable human, and their friendships were often the only space where that humanity was allowed to exist without judgment. The codes of loyalty. Every group developed its own rules, spoken or unspoken. 1. If one woman disappeared, the others searched. They asked around. They checked alleys. They visited lodging houses. They questioned clients. They didn't let the city swallow another friend without resistance. 2. If a violent man appeared, they warned everyone. Names were whispered from one end of the neighborhood to the other, descriptions memorized, habits noted. The knowledge spread faster than any police bulletin ever could. 3. If a woman was sick, others covered for her. They bought her soup. They warmed bricks to place at her feet. They took her usual spots to protect her reputation from the police. 4. If a woman had a child, they helped raise it. They watched over babies in shifts, sang them to sleep in cramped rooms, gave coins whenever they could spare them. 5. If a woman found a safe lodging house, she told the others. Safety wasn't hoarded, it was shared. These rules weren't written down. They didn't need to be. They lived in the hearts of women who understood exactly what they were up against. The women who led without titles. Every neighborhood had its quiet leaders, older women who had survived long enough to gain experience, respect, and influence. They were called Auntie, Ma'am, Miss Margaret, Rosie the Tall, Old Nan, Big Kate. They weren't leaders because of age alone. They were leaders because they knew which officers could be bargained with. They knew which alleys were newly dangerous. They knew which men carried knives. They knew how to handle the mood of a drunken sailor. They knew which boarding houses were fronts for exploitation. They knew where a woman could get medicine or rest. And perhaps most importantly, they were the ones who stayed when things got frightening. These women didn't command, they guided. Their voices were anchors. Their warnings were law. Their presence was comfort. And when they died, which happened often and painfully, the neighborhood felt the loss like a cracked rib. Fights, arguments, and the fragility of trust. This world wasn't perfect, and neither were the women living in it. Arguments erupted over clients, money, jealousy, space, alcohol, pride, rumors, misunderstandings, exhaustion. Voices raised, tears flowed, doors slammed. Sometimes fists were thrown. But fights didn't last long. There wasn't time for grudges. There wasn't luxury for pride. There wasn't room for fractured alliances. By the next night, women were sharing bread again, walking again, watching each other's backs again. Survival demanded reconciliation, and reconciliation demanded empathy. Moments of celebration in a harsh life. If you walked through the poorer districts late at night, you might stumble upon moments of unexpected joy. Women dancing together outside a tavern, laughter echoing through a foggy alley, someone singing an old folk tune, a birthday celebrated with a half-stale cake, two women spinning in the street like children, friends linking arms, warm despite the cold, stories told in the glow of a street lamp, dreams shared over cheap gin. These weren't acts of denial. They were acts of defiance, against despair, against hunger, against loneliness, against the narrative that their lives were worth less. Joy wasn't rare, it was revolutionary. The quiet acts of heroism. Some of the bravest acts in the entire city happened between women no one respected and no one protected. Heroism looked like sharing the last crumbs of bread, pulling a friend away from a dangerous man, giving up a night's earnings to pay for someone's medicine, holding a woman's hand through withdrawal or illness, running into alleys when they heard a scream, walking miles in the cold to check if a friend had made it home, staying awake until dawn, waiting for someone who never arrived, keeping hope alive even when the city tried to crush it. This wasn't romantic heroism. It was everyday heroism, the kind that saves lives quietly with no audience. When sisterhood was all they had. Victorian society built walls between women, class walls, moral walls, legal walls, economic walls, walls of judgment and shame. But women in the night tore down those walls and built bridges out of necessity and compassion. Their friendships softened the violence, shared the burden, eased the loneliness, created stability where there was none. The polite world believed these women were isolated, selfish, and morally lost. But in truth, their loyalty was deeper than the friendships of aristocrats. Their empathy was sharper than any moralist's sermon. Their community was stronger than the systems designed to erase them. Sisterhood wasn't optional. It was salvation.
Victorian London survives today in photographs, museum exhibits, novels, old maps, and tourist sites. People walk past grand buildings and whisper about ghosts, or admire the architecture, or imagine a romantic past full of horse-drawn carriages and swirling fog. But the past they imagine isn't the past that existed. The real Victorian London, the one built at night, in alleys and boarding houses and broken neighborhoods, has been mostly erased from the official story, not because it was unimportant, but because it was inconvenient. History likes to honor those who shaped nations, but it often forgets those who held the city together at its seams. Women who worked in the night left few diaries, no monuments, no family archives. Their lives are scattered in police logs, medical reports, newspaper headlines, and whispered memories. Yet they shaped the city as much as any politician or industrialist. This final chapter is not about their tragedy, it's about their impact, their endurance, their defiance, their humanity, and how the city that tried to forget them still carries its footprint in its deepest corners. The city that wasn't what it pretended to be. By daylight, Victorian London liked to present itself as the pinnacle of progress. Clean moral standards, high society elegance, industrial triumph, empire and power, charity and compassion. But these values were a costume worn by a city whose true engine churned beneath the surface. The nighttime economy wasn't an aberration, it was the shadow that made the light possible. It absorbed the needs society refused to acknowledge. It carried the emotions people weren't allowed to express.
It filled the cracks left by inadequate wages and rigid hierarchy. It provided an outlet for loneliness, hunger, and desire. It allowed the respectable to maintain their illusions of virtue. The polite version of London needed the hidden version to survive, and the women who worked its nights were the unspoken architects of that survival. Invisible contributors to a great city. These women fed the economy, supported sailors, soldiers, and laborers, kept countless men from spiraling into violence or despair, sustained entire districts through their spending, helped businesses survive, helped each other survive. They were part of the city's rhythm, unnoticed, unthanked, but essential. Every coin they earned flowed into bakery tills, pub registers, lodging house pockets, clothing market stalls, street vendors with meager earnings, coal sellers, shopkeepers trying to stay afloat. Even at the bottom rung, their labor circulated wealth. Without their contributions, many impoverished neighborhoods would have collapsed entirely. They were pillars of the urban underground economy, but history rarely acknowledges its pillars unless they are men. The cost of erasure. When a woman died, whether from sickness, violence, hunger, cold, or despair, her story usually ended in silence. No obituary, no eulogy, no headstone. Over time, entire generations of women disappeared into the gaps of history. Their absence from official records wasn't an accident, it was a choice. A society that defined itself by morality couldn't admit it relied on the labor of women it condemned. A city obsessed with reputation couldn't acknowledge the suffering that propped it up. A government that preached purity couldn't confront the brutality of its own policies. So these women were forgotten, or worse, remembered only as cautionary tales. But forgetting doesn't change what happened. Forgetting doesn't undo the injustice. Forgetting doesn't erase the truth. The truth is carved into the city's bones. And yet, despite everything, the lives of these women sparked change. Reformers demanding better housing invoked the conditions these women endured. Journalists pushing for improved policing cited their experiences. Doctors studying public health learned from the diseases that ravaged them. Working-class movements drew strength from their struggles. Women's rights activists highlighted their lack of legal protection. Slowly, painfully, the Victorian world began to shift. Not fast enough for the women who needed help most, not enough to save thousands who lived and died unseen, but enough to begin conversations that modern society continues today. The right to safety, the right to dignity, the right to a fair wage, the right to medical care, the right to be believed, the right to be human without condition. The women of the night weren't failures, they were catalysts. Strength that survived even when they didn't. It's easy to call these women victims, victims of circumstances, of violence, of injustice, of poverty. But they were also something else, something more powerful, survivors. They navigated a world stacked against them. They learned the city's shifting rules. They saved each other's lives more times than history ever recorded. They found humor in misery. They created moments of warmth in freezing rooms. They found beauty where the world saw only ruin. They endured. Courage isn't always dramatic. Sometimes courage is simply continuing to walk a dangerous street because there is no other choice. If courage is measured by endurance, then these women were some of the bravest souls Victorian London ever knew. The ghosts still walking the streets. Walk through modern London, through Whitechapel, Spitalfields, Lambeth, Soho, Southwark, and you're walking over histories no one teaches. The museums won't tell you that some buildings were once lodging houses filled with hungry women. The plaques won't mention that certain alleys were escape routes. The tour guides won't say that some grand avenues were built over demolished slums. But if you walk at dusk, when the city quiets and the past feels close, you might sense echoes, a whisper of laughter from a group of friends outside an old pub, the faint impression of footsteps on cobblestones, the memory of gaslight flickering against brick, a presence lingering where countless women once stood waiting for a night that might bring danger or nourishment or both. The city remembers, even when its people forget. The ghosts aren't malicious, they're reminders. History doesn't belong only to the powerful, it belongs to the forgotten too. Their legacy lives in the light. The women who walked Victorian London's nights didn't choose their legacy. Society chose to overlook it. But their real legacy is vast. They taught us about survival, about resilience, about the importance of community, about the brutal consequences of inequality, about the strength found in sisterhood, about the cost of moral hypocrisy, about humanity in the harshest conditions, and, perhaps most importantly, they reveal what a society values by showing whom it discards. Their lives force modern readers to confront the same question Victorian London avoided. Who gets to be seen as fully human? The final word. Victorian London wasn't just a city of fog and carriages. It was a city of women whose stories deserve to be told. A city shaped by their footsteps as much as by the powerful men etched into history books. A city that tried to bury them in silence, but cannot erase their truth. Because here you are, reading their world, feeling their fears, witnessing their courage, and in doing so, you are undoing some of that erasure. Their names may be lost, but their legacy isn't. Every time we acknowledge their humanity, we bring them back into the light. And the city, after all these years, finally feels a little more honest.